He stepped in close behind me as the wind pushed the loose panel toward our knees, his palms settling firm and warm on my hips to steady us both against the shaking fence. And in that charged second, I knew this visit would not end with a receipt and a wave across the driveway. He said my name in a voice that sounded like fresh sawdust and late afternoons, low and careful, while his thumbs pressed through the denim just enough to make me forget the rattle of nails in his bucket. The sun slid behind a thin cloud and the backyard went soft and quiet, and when I leaned back without planning to, I felt the deliberate way he did not step away. A neighbor's dog barked once and went silent again, which somehow made the whole street feel like it was listening, and I realized the story I would tell about today might begin with a broken fence and end somewhere I had never let myself imagine. He had introduced himself as Cal, though the name was written as Calvin on the card he handed me, the font plain and honest like everything else about him, from the scuffed leather tool belt to the sun-checked freckles along his forearms. I was the kind of client who over-explains, so I told him about the storm that slammed the back gate and twisted 3 posts, and he listened with a small smile that felt like permission to relax. He walked the length of the fence with a roll of measuring tape. Boots quiet in the grass, calling out numbers I pretended to understand, while I mostly watched the way his shoulders moved when he crouched. He asked for water without making it a big deal, and when I brought 2 bottles, he took both, passed one back with a thanks that landed lower than politeness, then knelt to mark the ground with calm, confident strokes. We started with the worst post because he said bad news should go first, and while he dug a neat, clean hole, I told him about the renters before me who never oiled the hinges, which led to him telling me about a cabin he was restoring alone over weekends, the kind of place that makes quiet feel like a reward instead of a sentence. Somewhere between our 3rd story and the first handful of gravel, he said he had been single for 2 years and did not miss the fighting, only the sound of another person closing a drawer gently because they knew he was still sleeping. I said something too honest about what it feels like to make coffee for one and watch it go cold anyway, and he looked up through the brim of his cap like he had been waiting for me to say exactly that. A gust slipped through the yard, knocking a loose slat against my thigh, and he stood quickly, one hand bracing the board while the other found my hip with a touch that was practical first, and only then something else. We carried the new post together because he said sharing weight saves time, and the way he walked backward while I walked forward felt like a dance invented by people who trust each other quickly. When the level showed bubble center, he grinned, a small private thing that made me want to invent more tasks he could praise, and I said I could hold the panel while he set the screws if he promised not to yell when I did it wrong. He said he had no use for yelling and every use for patience, then stepped behind me to guide the board into place with his hands broad at my hips, his breath warm near my ear as he lined the edges like a craftsman who enjoyed teaching. The drill whirred in short bursts, wood dust floating in the light between our faces, and I found myself answering his questions about music, weekends, and favorite takeout, with the kind of honesty that usually belongs to longer friendships and darker rooms. A car rolled past the alley and faded, the world resuming its late afternoon hush, and he asked if I had ever kept something good quiet because saying it aloud makes other people rearrange your life for you. I said yes too quickly, then asked the same question back, and he laughed without humor, admitting he had once kept everything quiet for so long that even the right words forgot how to find him. He told me the cabin was his way of practicing speaking again, plank by plank and nail by nail, and I told him the yard was mine, with its uneven mulch and stubborn rosemary that refuses to die or thrive. He said the rosemary just needed trimming and a little courage, then brushed a strand of hair from my forehead with a knuckle, as if it were as natural as replacing a hinge. The panel slipped and thumped my thigh, and we both lunged, his chest meeting my back as the board skated forward. And for a stretched, suspended moment we stood there, locked against the fence, breathing the same dry cedar air. He did not apologize for the closeness, and I did not joke my way out of it, because there are times when speaking is the smaller courage, and not speaking is the truer one. Hold there, he said, voice gentler than the words, and the sentence folded into my ribs like a promise that reached past the day. When the last screw bit cleanly and the board settled square, he stepped around to face me with his cap pushed back and his mouth shaping a smile that asked a bigger question than the one about payment. We carried the empty bags of concrete to the bin, and he said, I had decent form for someone who claims emails are heavy, which made me laugh harder than it should have, especially when he lifted a brow like he liked the sound of it. On the patio, I poured more water and wiped the wet circle he left on the table with the pad of my thumb, and he watched the small motion like it mattered more than tidiness, then asked if I ever ate late on purpose to stretch good company. I told him I did when the company wore a tool belt and made quiet feel useful, and he glanced at the kitchen door with a look that could have been curiosity or planning, or both in equal percentages. The light bent warmer across the yard, the fence now steady and calm, and somewhere inside my chest a door I had kept carefully latched decided it could survive being open. He gathered his tools slowly, not in a showy way, just in the pace of a man leaving a place he would not mind returning to, then stood with his hands at his hips and asked if I wanted a bid for the back gate, even though he already knew I did. I said yes, because the gate deserved kindness, and because I was not finished telling him about the rosemary, and his smile landed like gentle weather, the kind that takes a hard day and makes it soft. He said the gate would take an hour tomorrow if I could be here, and I said I could shift meetings because the fence had reminded me what should come first, which made him tilt his head like he understood exactly what I meant. When he reached past me to check the new latch, his arm brushed my side, and I did not step back, and he did not either, and the space between what we said and what we meant thinned to something you could measure with a thumb. He wrote the estimate on the back of his card and slid it across the table with fingers that lingered a heartbeat longer than business requires, then asked if I wanted him to stack the leftover lumber under the eave in case I needed a reason to call. I told him I already had a reason, but I would take the lumber anyway, and the look we shared made the alley feel like a stagehand, lowering the lights for a different scene. The day had rounded into that tender hour when birds practice evening, and as he shouldered the last board, he said my name again, not to get my attention, but to test how it sounded when we let it carry more than errands. He set the board down, wiped his palms on his jeans, and stood close enough that I could see the tiny chips of cedar caught in the hair on his forearm, then asked if I preferred late lunches or early dinners, because the gate might take longer than he had promised if we kept talking like this. I said early dinners lead to better late decisions, and he laughed in that quiet way that says yes without committing the crime of eagerness, then touched my hip once more to pass behind me toward the side gate, the contact so brief and deliberate it felt like punctuation at the end of a sentence we had only started. The latch clicked, the ally breathed, and he looked back over his shoulder with the cap pushed straight again, the expression of a man who knows how to build something square and true if you ask him with the right words. Tomorrow already felt closer than a calendar page, and the fence, steady and new, looked like a chalk line drawn across a court where two people finally agree which side they want to stand on together. I watched him go with a warmth that had nothing to do with sun, then turned to the fence and slid my palm along the smooth grain, practicing the courage it takes to invite a good thing inside. When he came back the next day, the sky was still pale from morning, and I was already standing at the back door with coffee I'd poured just in case he wanted some. He took it with a smile that started easy and ended a little slower, like maybe he was already thinking about the way yesterday had gone. The tools clinked gently in his bag, but it was the sound of his boots on the patio that made the yard feel smaller in the best way. He walked the line of the back gate with that same steady focus as before, running his palm over the grain, fingertips finding every spot that needed sanding. I leaned against the railing, telling him about a neighbor's cat that had wandered in during the night, and he told me about a coyote he'd seen while driving in. Neither story was really about animals, they were about keeping each other talking, letting our voices fill the quiet spaces. When he asked me to help hold the frame upright, he stepped in close enough that my shoulder brushed his chest. We didn't need to be that close. There was plenty of room, but he didn't move back, and I didn't either. He reached around me to adjust the clamp, his forearm brushing along my side, the warmth of his skin making the cool morning air feel irrelevant. We worked like that for a while, trading small touches that could still be explained away, but each one lasted a breath longer than it needed to. At one point, he rested his hand at my waist to steady me while I pressed the level against the hinge. It was practical. It was also not just practical. Halfway through, I went inside to refill the coffee, and when I came back out, he was standing with his cap pushed back, leaning on the frame like he had all the time in the world. "You're a good helper," he said, and the way he looked at me made me want to help him with things that had nothing to do with lumber. As we neared the end of the job, the air shifted. It wasn't just the sun climbing higher, it was the feeling of a decision hanging between us. The screws were in, the gate was swinging smooth on its hinges, and there was no reason to linger except the one we hadn't said out loud yet. He set the drill down slowly, like he was buying himself time, then stepped toward me. "You want to test it?" he asked, meaning the gate, but his eyes were asking something else entirely. I pushed the latch open, felt the gate swing, and then felt his hand settle at the back of my hip in a way that made the whole yard feel like it was holding its breath. The job was done, but neither of us made a move to leave. The latch clicked shut behind me, the gate swinging gently before settling back in place, and for a moment we simply stood there, two men in a quiet backyard, the faint smell of cedar mixing with the hum of a summer breeze. His hand, still resting on my hip, felt light enough to ignore if I wanted to, yet steady enough to make ignoring it impossible. He stepped just a fraction closer, the worn fabric of his work shirt grazing against my side, and started talking about how the fence should hold up for years. The words were about lumber and screws, but the way his voice had slowed, deepening into something lower, richer, told me this conversation wasn't really about a fence at all. I gave a quiet laugh and asked if that meant I wouldn't get to see him again until something broke. He tilted his head slightly, one corner of his mouth curling in a way that made my pulse rise, like he knew exactly what I meant and wasn't going to let me take it back. "You could always call me for other things," he said, and the way he let that sentence breathe between us was more deliberate than any tool in his bag. The wind shifted, carrying the faint rustle of leaves from the corner of the yard, but it did nothing to cool the heat gathering in that thin space between us. I moved my arm just slightly, brushing his, and felt the slow flex of his fingers at my hip before they reluctantly slid away. The loss of that touch was almost as noticeable as the touch itself. When he reached past me to grab a screwdriver from the railing, my body leaned forward without thinking, chasing the warmth I'd just lost. He noticed. Of course he noticed. And when his eyes met mine, there was no hiding the fact that this had already gone beyond neighborly politeness. He didn't pack up right away. Instead, he lingered, crouching down to check the latch again, then adjusting the hinge that didn't need adjusting, stretching out our time together under the easy excuse of just making sure it's right. I could see what he was doing, and I didn't want it to stop. When he finally stood, he let the drill rest on his shoulder and looked at me in a way that made everything else in the yard feel like background noise. "You want me to take a look at the shed while I'm here?" he asked, the words casual but his gaze fixed and unblinking. It was a question with two answers, and neither of them had anything to do with carpentry. I held his eyes for just a second longer than was safe, and in that moment we both knew I wasn't going to tell him no. The walk to the shed should have been nothing 6, maybe 7 steps across the yard, but each one felt heavier, as though we were crossing an invisible line we'd been dancing around for months. He didn't rush ahead, letting me match his pace, the slow rhythm of our steps, adding a quiet, deliberate weight to the moment. When we reached the door, he paused with his hand on the handle, glancing at me in a way that wasn't asking for permission out loud but was absolutely waiting for it in silence. I gave the smallest nod, and the corner of his mouth lifted not a full smile, but the kind you give when you know the answer you were hoping for has just been handed to you. The shed door swung open with a low creak, and the scent hit immediately. Sawdust, cedar, and a faint trace of oil. Sunlight poured through a single narrow window, striping across his broad shoulders as he stepped inside first, setting his drill on the workbench with a casualness that didn't match the charged air between us. "This hinge could use tightening," he said, eyes flicking to mine for a split second before he busied himself with a screwdriver. His tone was calm, but there was a fraction of delay before each word, like he was giving me a chance to interrupt, like maybe he wanted me to. I leaned on the doorframe, arms crossed, just watching him move. His shirt shifted with each reach, fabric stretching over the easy strength of his back. When he turned, he caught me staring. Instead of brushing it off, he let it hang there, his gaze holding mine longer than polite conversation would allow. "You're quiet," he said finally, and it sounded less like a comment and more like an invitation. I told him I didn't want to get in the way, and that's when he stepped toward me, slow, measured, deliberate. The door clicked shut behind me with the soft pressure of his palm, the faint thud sealing us in together. He didn't crowd me, not yet, but the closeness was undeniable. I could feel the heat radiating from him even with inches still between us, and my heartbeat had started matching the slow cadence of his movements. Then he reached out, not to adjust a tool, not to pass me something, but to set his hands firmly on my hips. It wasn't rushed or reckless. It was steady, almost grounding, like he wanted to make sure I felt every bit of his presence before anything else happened. And in that moment, with the muted light slanting across his face and the smell of cedar wrapping around us, I knew the shed had nothing to do with why we were here. His hands stayed on my hips like they belonged there, thumbs pressing just enough to let me feel the quiet steadiness behind the touch. He didn't rush, didn't speak, just let the weight of his palms settle until my body began to lean into them without thought. The shed felt smaller now, not because it was cramped, but because the air between us had changed, heavy and warm with something neither of us had ever put into words. Outside, the faint chirp of crickets drifted in through the window, and every so often a breeze would rattle the fence he had just finished repairing. "You know," he said finally, his voice softer now, "most people don't stand this close to their handyman." The way his eyes held mine made it clear he wasn't complaining. I smirked, tilting my head just slightly. "Most handymen don't stand this close to their clients." That earned me a quiet laugh from him, low, short, but with just enough of a grin to break through the tension for half a breath before it settled back, thicker than before. His fingers tightened against my hips, not hard, but enough for me to feel the shift in his breathing. When he stepped closer, the edge of the workbench brushed my back, and I realized he had moved me without either of us thinking about it. His shirt brushed my chest now, the faint smell of cedar and warm skin pulling me in further. "We should," he started, then stopped, his gaze flicking between my eyes and my mouth like he was trying to decide if finishing that sentence would undo everything or finally make it real. Instead of finishing it, he lifted one hand from my hip and let his knuckles trace the side of my shirt, slow enough that I could feel the drag of every second. My breath caught, and his smile deepened just slightly, like he'd been waiting to see if I'd react. The door creaked faintly in its frame, reminding me how close the rest of the world was, how easily someone could walk by. But neither of us moved. If anything, that risk made the space between us feel even more electric. And then, without a word, his other hand slid up my back, fingers spreading over my shoulder blade in a touch that was equal parts steady and claiming, like he'd just decided we were past the point of pretending. His hand stayed on my back, warm and steady, the slow spread of his fingers making it impossible to think about anything but the way he was holding me there. It wasn't force, it was intent, the quiet certainty of someone who had decided that whatever came next wasn't going to be an accident. The shed felt smaller with each breath, the air heavy with cedar, oil, and the faintest trace of his cologne. His thumb brushed over my shoulder blade, a small motion that somehow sent a shiver all the way down my spine. I shifted closer, almost without meaning to, and the change in the way he inhaled told me he'd noticed. "You know," he said, voice low enough that it barely reached above the quiet hum of the summer evening, "this isn't how I usually end a job." His lips curved in that small, half-contained smile that looked like it was keeping a bigger truth behind it. I let my hand rest against the side of his waist, feeling the give of muscle beneath the worn fabric of his shirt. "Guess it's not how I usually pay one," I replied, and his quiet laugh came out in one warm exhale. We didn't move for a moment, just stood there, close enough for the edges of our clothes to brush. Then he let go of my hip with one hand and, without breaking eye contact, reached past me to flip the small latch on the shed door. The click was soft but final, like the sound had sealed us in with whatever was about to happen. When he stepped forward again, the backs of my legs met the workbench, and the small jolt of contact made my breath hitch. His eyes tracked the movement, lingering there for a second before lifting back to mine. "You're sure?" he asked, not as hesitation, but as confirmation. A man who wanted to make certain the answer was as solid as the grip he still had on me. I nodded, and that was all it took. His hand returned to my hip, firmer this time, pulling me the last inch closer until my chest was against his. The heat between us felt immediate, like it had been waiting under the surface for months, maybe longer. He dipped his head just slightly, his breath skimming my cheek, close enough that if I leaned forward even a fraction our mouths would meet. Instead, he let the moment stretch, his fingertips pressing lightly into my sides, holding me there until the anticipation was as sharp as the contact itself. The hum of crickets outside felt impossibly far away, even though I knew our friends were only a few houses over, maybe even close enough to hear if the wrong sound carried. That thought didn't push me back, it pulled me in further, made every second feel more electric, like we were standing on the edge of something neither of us could take back. And then, finally, he closed the distance. His lips brushed mine once light, deliberate before pressing more firmly, the steady kind of kiss that told me he'd been holding it back far too long. My hand slid to the small of his back, and when he deepened the kiss, the last sliver of space between us disappeared completely. The shed didn't feel like a worksite anymore. It felt like the only place in the world that made sense. The kiss deepened slowly, the way water creeps higher at the shore, not rushing, but impossible to stop. His hand at my back slid lower, fingers splaying across my hip, pulling me against him with a quiet certainty that made my chest tighten. Every movement was deliberate, no frantic grabbing, no careless speed. Just the steady pressure of a man who wanted every second to count. I could feel the solid weight of him against me now, and the knowledge that anyone walking past the shed could hear or see more than they should made the air feel thicker. Outside, a muffled laugh floated across the yard. Someone from the neighbor's deck, close enough to remind me how little privacy we actually had. I felt him pause in the kiss, not pulling away, just letting the sound hang between us, like we were both weighing whether that risk made us stop or made us go further. When he moved again, it was with a new kind of heat. His palm slid up under the edge of my shirt, the rough texture of his work-worn fingers grazing my skin. The contrast sent a jolt straight through me. I caught my breath, and his mouth curved just slightly against mine, like he'd been waiting for that reaction. "You're warm," he murmured, his voice low and edged with something that made it clear he wasn't just talking about body temperature. I laughed quietly, soft, unsteady, and let my own hand find the space under his shirt, fingers meeting the firm lines of muscle his work had carved into him. He exhaled sharply, leaning into the touch, and for a moment the shed seemed to shrink around us again. A faint crunch of gravel sounded from somewhere beyond the fence, and his head tilted toward the noise without letting go of me. We stood still, breath held, until the sound faded. Then he looked back at me with a grin that was part relief, part challenge. "They almost caught us," he said, as if the idea was more exciting than dangerous. I swallowed, pulse still quick. Almost, I agreed, and that almost hanging there between us was exactly why neither of us stepped back. The space between us was gone now, no hesitations left, no careful half-steps to pretend this wasn't happening. His hand stayed firm on my hip, the other sliding higher along my back until his fingers curled into the fabric at my shoulder, holding me close like he'd finally decided there was no reason to let go. The kiss shifted, deepening, the kind of pull that comes when you both know you've crossed the invisible line, and there's no going back. I felt him press forward, the heat of his body melting away the cool night air that seeped in from the corners of the shed. Outside, the world was still alive, muffled voices carrying over the fence, the faint clink of bottles from somewhere down the street, but each sound only made the moment sharper, more urgent. Every brush of his thumb at my side, every press of his chest against mine, felt like we were writing something no one else was meant to read. "You feel that?" he whispered against my mouth, not as a question that needed an answer, but as a truth he already knew. I managed a breathless, "Yeah," and my hand slid lower, gripping the worn denim at his hips, pulling him in until there wasn't an inch left between us. His quiet groan was swallowed by the kiss, and the weight of it made my knees want to give. He broke away just long enough to look at me, eyes searching, checking for even the smallest flicker of doubt. There wasn't one. Whatever unspoken thing had been between us for so long had just found its form, and neither of us was about to undo it. His lips found the curve of my jaw, trailing lower until his breath was hot against my neck, and my head tipped back instinctively. My fingers tightened in the back of his shirt, grounding myself in the solid reality of him. Somewhere, beyond the walls of the shed, laughter rose and faded again. The reminder that our friends weren't far should have pulled me back to reason, but instead it only pushed me closer, made every second feel like it had to matter before the night caught up to us. When he finally pulled back, his forehead rested against mine, his breathing rough, his hands still claiming their place on me. "We're not stopping here," he said, steady and certain, and I knew he was right. This wasn't an ending, it was the start of something neither of us could have planned, but both of us had been waiting for. If you stayed with this story until the very last word, drop a comment saying, "The fence was just the excuse," so we'll know exactly who felt the heat, the risk, and the moment all the way through.